For streaming, are y'all good?
Yeah.
All right.
All right. So we've got the live stream up and going. That's great. If you want to grab a seat, anywhere you'd like.
Slide over to the side.
All right. So first of all, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out 8:30 in the morning or earlier if you're driving from Texas Tech. But thank you all for coming. One of the things that Jack Williamson Lecture has always been so fantastic about is bringing amazing creative writers, right, to talk about speculative fiction. We've had extraordinary guests of honor, and this year's guest of honor is going to be no exception to that great list. But we also have in the area a lot of academics who are working on speculative fiction and fantasy and science fiction. And so one of the things that we want to do going forward is also include some of that work as part of the Jack Williamson Lecture. So this is very much a kind of work in progress. We're figuring out how to do this, and today's roundtable, and I'll introduce the folks here in just one second, is a kind of baby step forward, right? Like what that could look like in the future. And we absolutely want to have all of you participate. I have some questions for the panelists, but at any point, please raise your hand, jump in with comments. This is supposed to be a kind of lively conversation. So let me go ahead and introduce our speakers, and we will get started. So in no particular order, we have Dr. Eduardo Ceh, who's an assistant professor of computer science. We have Dr. Michelle Schmidt, who is an associate professor of sociology. We have Dr. Erik Stanley, who is an associate professor of anthropology. We have Dr. David Sweeten, who is an associate professor of English and has done a fantastic job with the Jack Williamson Lecture this year. I just want to put that out there. And then I am your humble moderator, Dr. Micah Donohue. I'm an associate professor of English as well. So as I was kind of putting this roundtable together, I emailed our speakers a list of questions to think about. And the first question that I'm going to ask is also a way for our speakers to kind of introduce themselves more fully to you all this morning. And so I asked them, how have you incorporated speculative fiction, broadly defined, into your research and teaching already? Right? And so we'll start, Eduardo, with you, and we'll go kind of around like this, and then with the next question, we'll reverse that direction.
Hello, everyone. I'm Eduardo Ceh. I'm assistant professor of computer science. You might be wondering why computer science is in a panel of writers and science fiction. Well, part of my research is about natural language processing. So we analyze text with a bunch of algorithms, AI, all that stuff. And a way to do that with my students was analyzing sci-fi novels and text. So we actually created two projects. One of those won the second place in the Mexico Research Symposium, where we analyzed basically novels from 1930 to 1960. And it was a really cool project because we were really excited to work with all these algorithms, but apply it to something that is like robots and aliens and all this. So that's basically that's why I'm here today.
I'm Erik Stanley. I'm a professor of cultural anthropology, and I've used speculative fiction both in the classroom and especially in my class, the anthropology of science fiction, in which students thought about science fiction and made their own science fiction films, which were used to convey an anthropological concept. But my current research also has to do speculative fiction and kind of the intersection between anthropology and speculative fiction. I'm working at the Blackwater Draw Museum right now, and they have a display on some spheres which were used in an episode of the original Star Trek, which are modeled after Folsom spheres. So I'm looking at the relationship between the science fiction and how it relates to the science and how it changes people's perceptions of past.
As Micah introduced, I'm Dr. David Sweeten. I'm a professor of early British literature, which means I'm in charge of everything British before 1850. I try to sneak in, science fiction and fantasy wherever I can. My class coursework, I've included it. I started squeezing it in on my composition courses. Half of our load at our department is freshman composition. So I teach graphic novels, or I teach, speculative books, whether it's not David Butler or others. But then we have a cross-listed senior elective, also cross-listed as the graduate elective, that I taught as a fantasy class, right? And so I've done it as kind of a correlation of medievalism and fantasy, which is an interesting kind of corollary. And then last time I taught it in spring, I discussed, we talked about the kind of monstrous in fantasy, which is a kind of psychology, and we had a lot of texts that kind of pushed beyond Eurocentric fantasy. And the students really got into it. In fact, I had a lot of really great projects in the class in the spring, and so I helped the students organize a panel at the Southwest Popular Culture Association, which just happened in February, and they gave papers on their work from there, and it was a great conference, and they had some really excellent projects.
Yeah, they were really excellent. It was great to see. And that's something that I've had really enjoyed working with my colleagues here on this panel to foster the engagement between teaching and research. And we actually have a several-year history now of putting panels together for the Southwest Popular American Culture Conference. Sometimes including students, which of course is a great opportunity, but it also has really helped us cultivate and foster new ideas on how to use speculative fiction in the classroom. I teach sociology, so for me, of course, anything sci-fi is considering that interface between technology and society, what that means for social formation. Each of my intro theory courses covers themes like the relationship between social structure and agency, the way that technologies influence social interaction, the social, as we call it broadly in sociology, surveillance, control, how technologies and larger social structures change our social psychology. And sometimes these are really abstract and complex concepts for students. I mean, they are for all of us. They're things that, we're constantly working on as sociologists throughout our career. And one of the ways that we do that is looking at other real-world examples, cross-cultural examples. But another way that I found that's really accessible is looking at speculative fiction. It's a great way to envision alternatives that maybe we haven't seen firsthand, but can kind of imagine. And it really seems to help students to cultivate the thought exercises, they call them in class, of the philosophical side of sociology, and thinking about what some of these alternatives could look like. What might it look like if your entire city was run by an AI algorithm? What might the person who designed it have to do with how that algorithm operates? Questions that you can ask utilizing speculative fiction have been really helpful, both in my theory classes, and I also teach a sociology of media course where we kind of get more straightforward, I guess, with the use of speculative fiction. I've also had students put together panel presentations for SFPHC.
Yeah, well, thank you. So the next question is going to kind of dig a little bit deeper into how we can bring students into the research that we're doing. But David, like you were talking about bringing science fiction, speculative fiction into writing classes, and I try to do the same thing whenever I get the chance. In fact, today, right after this talk, I'm going to be running to teach a class at the local high school, and we're looking at N.K. Jemison's story, The Ones Who Stay and Fight, right, and how that, as she puts it, is a speech of and a reaction to the ones who walk away from homelessness. And I imagine you were talking about how this allows you to envision alternative futures and possibilities, different ways society is organized. Students really seem to get into that, right? And the way these kind of models are created. So the next question though that I wanted to ask, and Michelle will start again with you, is just for you to talk more about how you're working with students or how you plan to incorporate students into the research that you're doing on speculative fiction.
Every single couple words. Next two colleagues on the way back around. One of the subject areas that we presented about is popular culture and pedagogy, and it's a really robust kind of regular crew that shows up at SMUKCA. And it's all about that and how we can use speculative fiction and other forms of popular culture in the classroom. And that, it wasn't initially a research area of mine. I'm an environmental sociologist, I studied international development. But we're all generalists here at UNU. We teach a lot of different things. We cultivate a lot of new skill sets. And so through the course of teaching sociology and media and the theory courses, working with people, I started kind of doing more research, more specifically on pedagogy. So turning the classroom into formative research. And that was a lot of really good experience giving us with both teaching and trying to cultivate the research that we're doing.
Yeah, a couple of things, but to start, I'll jump off this as well. The pedagogy and the popular culture that we started working on together, we started, and I won't talk about the details of the inside. I wanted to talk about it. But upon Erik's recommendation, we started using a game called Fiasco, which is a DM-less kind of role-playing game. What I used it for in particular in my courses is I had a composition course that I themed around the idea of heroes, right? Superheroes, classical heroes, mythological heroes, what have you. And we used this Fiasco. What's great is you can have different sets and different kind of genres. And so we had science fiction Fiasco play sets, and I had a fantasy, like a D&D fantasy kind of play sets, and I had a noir kind of play set. And having all of those together allowed us to students to really dig into what were the particulars, not just of that genre, but what were there for our class. What does that genre ask of its heroes, and what does it expect of them, right? And it was an incredibly engaging activity. The students got really into it. They wanted to keep playing it in subsequent classes. Here's what we were working on at the time. More specifically, and beyond that, I've also, as I said, I have a course focused around fantasy. It's a course we try to teach semi-regularly, at least every 4 years. And what's been kind of great about it is the chance to welcome students to engage in these extensive research projects. There's a lot of work going on in speculative fiction at the critical level, and so guiding them along in the process, encouraging them to do research has been just fantastic. And students have produced some excellent work. A student, for example, at this Micah, she presented on another panelist this year for us, Rebecca Donohue's Black Sun, and kind of the way it engages post-colonial life. And it was, some fantastic work. And so, I guess for me, from an educational perspective, part of what I'm trying to do is help students kind of grow. And a good way to reach is to find something they're already invested in, intrigued on, and help them develop the skills alongside it. And they've really surprised me how they've developed.
I've already talked a little bit about the Star Trek project. Students are helping on that one because they are often the people working at the museum, so they're administering the surveys to visitors, so they get that kind of first-hand experience with academic research in the classroom. And David and Michelle have also touched on the Fiasco article, which we used in the science fiction classroom in order to make their movies and kind of the screenplay scaffolding, which we used to kind of flesh out those ideas. And in my current anthropological writing class, they're also engaged with the speculative fiction and media more broadly. And we've been doing a project in which we've been looking at the history of television, taking television episodes of various genres from different decades and kind of analyzing the anthropological themes. So trying to use students' kind of inherent interest in media as a way to talk about these larger issues.
And I will say I was there for the drafting of this short film ideas, these fiasco, and it was really great how Erik brought them in and how quickly that used to generate ideas. It was a lot of fun.
Those are really nice topics. I always tell my students that if you study computer science, you can fit anywhere, right? Because if you use a computer, we can be there. So while you are talking, I really start working like, how can I use these topics, these projects with my students? And for example, next spring, I'm going to teach a course about applied machine learning. And in that course, I'm going to show my students different algorithms on how to work with text. That is a different type of data that called rows and columns. And I was thinking, I mean, there are a lot of tools that we can create from our side, computer science perspective that can help you a lot in your project. For example, one of the goals that I had with my colleagues related to Sci Fi was to extract topics from these novels and try to understand the different topics that Sci Fi from the 30s to the 60s were trying to talk about. And it was interesting because you can find specific words like spaceships or aliens or soldiers or wars and all that stuff. So we can create algorithms, and that's something I want to show my students in this course, that we can take thousands of documents and analyze them in just a couple of seconds. So for our project, we work with more than 2,700 documents, and we have analyzed all that stuff in less than a minute. So imagine how can we help to your students to analyze a really big portion of the document, and what the amount of time that we can save doing that instead of reading all that stuff, all that paper. So yeah, my brain is working. Sorry.
Well, no, that's really fascinating. And one of the questions I wanted to ask Eduardo, specifically you, about this kind of algorithmic driven analysis and the computer analysis of this large corpora text is, if you're looking at text from the 1930s to the 1960s, and you're seeing things like spaceships and aliens, probably terms you would expect to find. Was anything surprising? Did you expect
I mean, of course, the corpus that we use is kind of biased because it's a public project Gutenberg, so it's 90% of the document that you can download from there is from that time. But we apply different algorithms with different levels of granularity of the things that we want to discover. Based on the algorithms, we can even find more specific things, not only the spatial data. It's kind of something that you expect. But you can find more things about mankind or the role of women in those type of things. So, but again, it's a lot of work to tune out all those algorithms. But yeah, it was a good experience because we applied like 4 different algorithms. Really simple algorithms called Micah words that basically you throw every word there and then let the algorithm to analyze that, to really complex neural networks where they can really understand the context of each word and try to come up with some answer.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. So the next question I want to ask, I'll just throw it out to everybody in the panel, and also this will be a great opportunity if those in the audience want to chime in as well. Because we've been talking about like different ways to teach science fiction text, analyze science fiction text, fold our students into presentations or research projects that we're working on. But at a more abstract level, I'm wondering, can we conceptualize the classroom as a science fictional space? And one of the texts that I'm thinking about in the back of my mind is a book I'm sure many of us know, Octavia's Brood, the collection that came out. Lolita and Alicia was involved with that. And in the foreword that she writes, she thinks about science fiction. Yes, of course, the literature that's being written and the work that scholars and writers are doing, but also the ways that it can be a kind of social practice and the way that it can connect with like activism, but also like pedagogy to any number of other kind of activities and practices that students and we ourselves can be a part of. So I know it's a kind of big question, but I'm curious when we think about the classroom space, the teaching space, as science fiction in some way.
Yeah, well, one thing that I've been thinking about with the classroom as a science fiction space, especially in the context of this writing class, is in the next week or two, we're going to start. We've been doing a number of different kinds of papers, content analysis, book reviews, op-eds, museum tours. And kind of to wrap up the semester, we're kind of looking to the future, and we're going to be talking about ChatGPT and how to use AI to write, and what that kind of looks like for the future, especially as a lot of these students go out into jobs in which this is going to become part of their everyday life. And it's something that, not even 5 years ago would have seen. It's just kind of completely science fiction, but to have it as part of their everyday life, I think is a really interesting thing, and a way to latch on to kind of what's going on.
Anyone not use ChatGPT lately? I haven't actually used it as to get them to do it, but just as an example of AI, which you kind of empower. It seems so futuristic, and now here we are. They actually have learned about it in comp class in their group. So I was like, have you heard about this? Yeah, we just talked about this in comp too. And I was telling Micah yesterday that you guys still have to remember to write. You need to know how, preferably in cursive, teach your children. This is how the human assistants will communicate with you.
Yeah, I gotta say, I'm a little salty, guys. Someone teaching 2 comp classes this semester, I've already seen more than my share of ChatGPT work. Just look at that way. Yeah, I guess, it's strange. So my kind of field of trade is medieval, right? I'm a medievalist, that's where I work in, 13th, 14th century England. And a constant work in that classroom, is getting students to conceptualize the kind of medieval imaginary, the kind of mental state of people in that period, in that time, in this kind of social historical context. And it's difficult because they have perceptions, biases, ideas that are innately different than our own kind of modern perceptions. It sometimes takes work to get students to apply that there, right? To kind of recalculate or recalibrate their kind of thinking in that sense. But then we also continuously bring it forward as well. Why does this matter to us now? Why are we still reading this? What's interesting when I get to work with speculative fiction is that we're not just casting back, we're also casting parallel, or casting to the future. We get to think about, well, what does this say about where we are now, where we're going to in the future, right? What we're really concerned about now. One thing we often talk about in my fantasy and monstrous is that monstrous elements often reflects the kind of fears and concerns of the person writing, right? Or of the culture that they come from. And so thinking about, well, what are we worried now, the kind of current things, current science fiction. And it's interesting both in how things stay the same, but also in the development of new fears, like the fears of having to rewrite your entire curriculum based on ChatGPT.
Well, I don't know that deep. How I consider my class of science fiction environment. But because we deal with algorithms, I tell my students that you will start seeing the matrix, right? Like the movie. So you will start seeing all those ones and zeros when you start learning those algorithms. And I can see their faces like they take some algorithms and they say, oh, now I get how this works. Right? So that's how I try to perceive this like a science fiction environment. So now they are able to see in their mind how all these things that I'm going to say regular people use it, but now we understand how these are created. I also talk with my students about the ethics in AI, in machine learning, all this stuff. And a really simple example that you can do is you can go to Google and type Randa, and all the images that Google is going to show you are white men. right? So there's a lot of bias, and that basically is because of the data that these algorithms are using is not correct, right? So I'm trying to talk about all those stuff, not give us my points.
A question for you, Eduardo, just on that, right? Because what I find really interesting, we often hear that our students are digital natives, right? They know this digital space. What I find is that they're only digital natives insofar as the front end of the UI is, right? They don't understand they have back end in there as well. And what I find interesting is, and I don't know if you have any thoughts on this, is how algorithms limit their experience in ways that oftentimes students are entirely unaware of. They don't understand that, for example, what they're seeing on YouTube is the algorithm feeding them, not necessarily what is the best media or the best content or searches on Google, right? Oftentimes, engineer, and it's not necessarily the best possible result for what you want, what the algorithm is feeding them. And that kind of back end, you say you're helping your students see the matrix, right? That's great. I want more of our students to see the matrix, because otherwise they don't understand that it is a matrix, right?
Yeah, so that's what I try to do with my students, that teach them the algorithms behind all those. In this class, I'm going to teach my screen. I'm going to cover neural networks. And in that class, I will tell them about different cost functions and how neural networks learn and how you can tweak those parameters to make them do stuff that benefits basically the company and the result. But that's what we try to teach students. Not part that regular people cannot see because they don't need to see. Like, so that makes
Well, David, I really liked the point that you were making about how, you're not just casting back, and you're not just projecting into the future, you're also drawing these different parallels. And, I think that's something that science fiction and speculative fiction is so extraordinary at doing, right? It can project us forward in time and space, but it's always in dialogue with what's happening in the world right now. And usually in profound ways, it's in dialogue with history as well. And it just strikes me that there's an analogy between what science fiction is doing and what's happening in the classroom, where they also in this space that are making similar connections. And as educators, it seems like we're constantly in a sort of science fictional mode. I mean, even etymologically, right? If we think about the strange conjunction that is science fiction and the history of science, knowledge, and then the history of fiction etymologically for making, right? That is kind of coexist. So I don't know, it seems like there's something there that can be explored further, maybe with our graduate students or with our students. The last question, though, that I want to ask before we just open it up to any questions or comments that the audience has, specifically relates to the Jack Williamson lecture and how you all envision incorporating academic research and academic component into the lecture going forward, what that might look like, right? With a moment of speculation for ourselves here.
Something I was thinking about specifically this year with our virtual guest of honor, and because my team's work was just super, super relevant for my teaching unit on theories of modernization and postmodernism. And we're just feeling a lot of, many of the more buzzwords I mentioned earlier, certainly what that means, and human nature hybrids, human technology hybrids, and this kind of thematic work. And I was thinking, since we tend to know our guest of honor earlier on, that I can make sure to incorporate that into, because I teach theory every semester, so that I can incorporate that into my class, and possibly have students do their, because they each do a presentation on the theoretical concept, and use that author's work with that concept specifically to make their element hybrid introduction. I did something similar, really invited Alice Rivera, because I was fortunately teaching a unit on Marxist theories as they came into the present day. So it was a very after that, but I hadn't had the bigger concept of kind of integrating the two. So while I did have them attend, I didn't have them actually apply or work in their own presentations. So that was one idea that I had this semester. Oh man, it's great work, and I wish that you were too.
Yeah, no, I mean, not only can we kind of bring the guest of honor's work into our classroom and have students work with it, which is fantastic. There may be ways to bring the students then into the lectureship.
Right,
and
that's
share that. Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking about that as well when Alice was here. I was when I ran that science fiction class, and the students ended up making the movies for that class using science fiction to teach an anthropological concept, and then we ended up running those movies just kind of before his Thursday talk, I think it was. So I think kind of going forward, I'd like to do something like that again, is create projects, presentations, or some kind of thing in class that have a forum for students to share those as part of the lectureship.
Yeah, I was thinking similarly on both fronts, right? We regularly try to off-teach and integrate these things. So any new form for our students to demonstrate their work, right, is always a good thing. But not just our students. I think there's a lot of scholars in our general region that are working in speculative fiction. And one of my goals with the lectureship is to try to bring more constituencies in together. Right? We're working on campus across various areas. This panel is part of that, right? But also, I think reaching out to Texas Tech, MSU, UAM, these other local kind of universities where people are doing this kind of work and bringing their voices in. It's a fantastic opportunity.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just got back from the Latinx Visions Conference a couple weeks ago. There's just an incredible variety of community of scholars in the area doing work on speculative fiction in various ways. So bringing more of that into the lectureship would be awesome. Awesome to do that.
Yeah, I don't have in mind like a specific I can collaborate with a lectureship, but I'm sure that I can collaborate with them. If I need to try any of those algorithms in your projects, we can do something interesting. So that's
Yeah, well, I mean, and not just collaboration with other universities in the area, but interdepartmental collaboration. Just figuring out ways to take advantage of the work you're doing.
I think there's other areas on campus we can bring folks in. I mean, like, Erik, Michelle, and I, and Micah started working together in serious things. We did a panel at Swapaka, was it 2018? We did that panel on Westwood. 2018, yeah. So we started doing some kind of work there. But I think reaching out to other areas, like computer science, I think getting digital theater and film more important, that would be great. Right? I think there's plenty of other areas to bring in. Because one of the unique things we offer here in the leadership, strive where we're unique.
Okay, play to our strengths. What about folks in the audience? We've got about 15-20 minutes now for questions, or comments, or ideas. Yeah, please.
I'm a librarian at Texas Tech, and probably like a lot of people here, I got invited to beta test BARD, which is the Google's Chat GPT. And it's pretty good. I'm also previously was a copy editor. It's not great. It's, looking at it and I like how it's not like plagiarizing, you try to find where did you get this data from? It's not really plagiarizing, so it's it's not plagiarizing anything specifically. But in my mind, as a speculative fiction writer, what are we thinking about when the pendulum swings the other way? So now we're over here, our computers are doing our work for us, and that becomes not great. We're seeing how that's affecting our mental health or something. What about when the pendulum swings the other way and we're all very much okay, that wasn't working. Now what? That's just when we're talking about ChatGPT, that's where my mind went. And when I'm working with BARD, that's where my mind goes. I'm like, when we decide this, our kids are growing up and they can't write a grocery list to save their lives. unless they can use their phone to do it or whatever, and we realize that's not great. Like, what kind of things are we thinking about when it swings the other way?
Well, one, I welcome pendulum swing the other way. It's some
Right?
things,
No, no, me too.
It's interesting, you know, I mean, I'm not trying to, I don't know, whatever. But I've been teaching since 2007. Just in that time, I've seen some significant changes in my students' go. My average student now does not type their paper with the keyboard. They type their papers on the phone, right? And for them, I was really confused because I'm like, this seems ridiculous to me, right? It would take so much longer. But they're like, no. They never took a class on how to type. So they don't know how to type, but they know how to text.
And cursive writing, right?
Right, exactly. And you know, but there's other like elements of what I'm seeing already in ChatGPT that I feel are gonna have some lasting factors, right? Students don't want to take the time to do things because it's so easy. So it feels like a waste of their time. Something that told you to try to write that themselves. And that's, you know, disheartening because you're missing out on a lot of these key skills in order to get it. And that's not even getting to the content. Again, as somebody who's done too deep this semester, spent too many hours evaluating ChatGPT generated writing. You know, the writing it produces is so shallow, right? And a lot of times it's created just as, it's not plagiarizing anything because it's plagiarizing an entire database.
Plagiarizing what?
An entire database.
Oh, yeah.
It has a huge list, it's just encapsulated and reconstructed in that way. And, you know, that's a problem for some. You know, a lot of them frankly would not have read the paper even without it, you know, and that's a problem. And it's missing kind of those key things we're looking for as what are we getting on this work. So my fear, I guess, to sum it up, my fear is that it's going to take a while for students and perhaps society at large to realize that maybe the work we're producing is interesting and there's great potential to produce some really good stuff. But sometimes the results that we're getting from it aren't what we want. And it's hard to kind of process that because it's so easy.
Was grandpa example.
Mm-hmm.
Are you seeing that with the types of texts or in the writing that ChatGPT generates, like the biases that are on the back end, that maybe then shape the outcomes that we can get, which then shape the way that we think about whatever questions we're asking without even really realizing it, algorithm style.
So it depends on the backend algorithm that they are using. On that version of ChatGPT that they're using. So now it's version 4, it's like the more powerful version, and we can incorporate information from internet almost real time. So that's cool information. For the next generation that they're testing, it's not going to give you the text directly. It will use what the output will be to be an input to try to think if that's the correct thing that is going to tell. If not, it can like make a reflection and change that way. Yeah, now the next version will be even better. Like it will have like a way of thinking the answers before they do it. So it will be even harder for us to detect if that's something.
Things that I kind of always go back to with this kind of promise and peril of AI and ChatGPT type things is Walter Benjamin's article on art of the age of mechanical reproduction. Right? Beginning of the 20th century, people were afraid that copy machines and printers and later CGI would get rid of the artist. It would make things just so easy that we wouldn't need art anymore. Right? Computers would be good. I think we've seen a lot of that happen, but at the same time, we've seen new potentials for art, people using these new media to create things that weren't even possible before. And it's also at the same time kind of driven up the value of these traditional art. Right? To paint today is much more valuable because of all these other technologies which make it easier, right? So rather than kind of saying, oh, this is terrible, or this is great, kind of looking at the potential of both for good and for maybe not so good. But thinking about how it could be used creatively as a tool and teaching that, right? Like the thing about an algorithm is your output's only going to be as good as what you put into it. So teaching, what we teach students is going to change, but it's going to change in a way that we're teaching them to interact with these programs, right? So you can have ChatGPT write you a story in the style of Cormac and Harvey, but if you don't know who Cormac and Harvey is, you're not going to even think of doing it.
Yeah, and there's something that a new area now is called prompt engineering. So that's basically, if you don't know what to type, to ask to ChatGPT, it's going to give you anything. But if you know more about the topic, you can guide these technologies to give you better tools. It's like when we started using calculators, right? It's just a tool, but if you don't know what the mathematical operation you want to do, it's not going to do anything. I remember that ChatGPT is a large language model that basically uses probability. So what's the probability of the next word given the previous word? And that's how it works, it's just probability. It's not really thinking if this is making any sense, it's just probability. The next version, probably that it will think, is this output really what you want to so,
not to get incredibly science fictional about it, but as a science fiction writer and a former academic, two things. One, can it really think if it doesn't have volition on its own? Personally, until you show me something that has preferences that do not derive from input, that's not AI. It is a large language model. It's really interesting, but it's not AI. And we should stop calling it AI, but that's my own personal hobby horse. Secondly, to go to that prophetic example, I have done the thing where I've asked ChatGPT for a short story in the style of Arthur Martinez, and it's very bad. And not because it's picking the wrong style. I do think it's doing exactly what you're describing in the sense of probabilistically, what sort of words do I tend to use? What does the pattern of sentence structure look like? It can copy that. What it can't do is copy intention. And this is why I think it will be a really exceptional tool for producing good outlines. And in my day-to-day work, there are times when I wish I could give it to some of my coworkers so that I would get paragraphs that followed each other in order. But I don't have this crushing fear that some of my fellow authors seem to have, that this means that no one will ever publish anything again that's generated by an algorithm, because it's just not very good. And I don't know how you get to it being very good without it actually being in mind, which it's not going to be in the direction that a large language model goes, to my understanding of large language models. There may be infinite levels of meta recursion which can copy them very closely, but without that internal drive, why would it do it? So.
Yeah, and you mentioned using it for outline generation. This is kind of a rush now of figuring out how to use AI or ChatGPT tools in the classroom, composition classroom. And some scholars, some instructors are using it as such, using it as a way to prep work or to help organize things. So I think that's definitely these other areas. To be clear, I'm not trying to say damn all new technology.
Oh, no.
I guess I'm more concerned about how it's changing public perception in using technology or where technology will supplant things. But I think you all make some very strong points.
Well, I think the kind of floodgates have been open on who's going to be able to generate the next version of ChatGPT and who's going to come up with the version after that. And I wonder if we're going to reach a point where the loop of self-reflection and meta-analysis is so sophisticated that it may not ever be able to create a novel like in your style as you're describing it that's convincing. but it may be able to start pumping out blockbusters from Hollywood, right? Where like they're already following a kind of algorithmic script for what a blockbuster should look like. Is that just going to become a way to pump commodities out for people to, spend lots and lots of money on? I mean, that was one of the things that we're concerned about, right? Is the way this becomes commodified. And so I think there's always going to be room for the creative writers here to put wonderful works of art into the public sphere. But I think there's also going to be an attempt to capitalize on this to, the furthest extent possible.
I want to go back to something David said and argue over, bridge it over to what I'm hearing right now. I think back to when years ago, one of our goals in liberal arts, preparation was computer literacy. And back then, that meant you learned how to use Word, Excel, and nobody needs that. Ain't nobody got time for that anymore. However, having computer literacy kind of training that focuses on removing that curtain a little bit and introducing students to what's behind the user interface. But more importantly, looking at both ethical issues and being a wise consumer in terms of looking at whether something is an appropriate tool as opposed to a substitute for human intervention. Yesterday we were talking about something and somebody said, well, that's like using a screwdriver for a hammer. And I said, well, I usually use my heels as a hammer, but they're not made for that, but they work well. But the thing is, for example, the medical therapy professions, they're talking about using ChatGPT to take over the time that after you interface with the client, speaking and saying this is what happened and having it write up the notes, which is very time consuming and keeps you from going and helping the next time. That seems like a good tool. But there was also at the same time an article about, well, if I input all of this, it'll come up with a diagnosis and plan of treatment. And I think that's terrible. That's substituting. So I think there's room for us redefining computer literacy at a college level and using it. That's just the thought.
I will just add that, we don't call it computer literacy anymore. Librarians have been calling it information literacy for over a decade.
That's
And
true.
we've been doing that. So,
Yeah.
there's some great interchangeable work.
I agree.
I think there's room to circle back to the comments on how we're using ChatGPT maybe to supplement therapy and things like that with commodification, right? I've taken some academic advising and very similar typing up notes over meetings with students. The technology didn't make the process better because it made the process faster. Because what that did is that meant that now we could see more students because we had more time for them, which was not good for the interactions, the quality of the students, and was not good for the overall health of the academic advisor trying to engage with students and get to deep questions about why they're in college, right? And that's the commodification, and that, in my mind, loops back to talk about the mass production of art, right? I imagine a few of us in here have watched Japanese anime, and of course, if you do some digging, the people that are doing the grunt work of that animation are making terrible money. They're cranking out a lot of work for very little kind of social benefit in terms of themselves, commodification of their work. They're not being paid well, they're not getting support, it's just not the healthy environment. And so commodification is something to include in these conversations of how these tools are going to be used. Do they improve the quality of life overall for people that are using the tools, or do they circle back around and then just allow us to get back to the grind faster and wear down people and machine? Sorry, thought there.
That's good. I really like the distinction you're drawing there between expediting and improving. which I potentially could, but it can come good and bad.
Yeah, other questions from the audience or comments?
Well, we fear, like, as composition professors, like, we have to do dozens and dozens of papers all the time. We have to check for check. This question, can we reverse it and have them grade us?
I mean, the problem there is this, I actually had this discussion a few years ago, which is precedent this, with a different computer science professor, who told me, it's like, I was talking about the times we agreed, and his comment was like, why don't you just make a number? And my response was, well, here's the problem, because grading is not just, for composition, it's not just about, was this paper correct, right? Or did they make the right moves or incorrect? It's about using that as a demonstration of the writing. Where are you right now? What skills are you demonstrating that you can master? What skills have you not mastered yet? And what kind of advice can I give you to help you progress and grow in a way that's going to get you the skills you need to master and to work in a functional way, and then develop the skills you need at large for college writing. And that's a much harder can of worms for an algorithm, right? So I think if it were a matter of simple grammar, I mean, I think that's easier for AI. We've had that for a while, right? My students constantly talk about the red and green squiggles on Word. Although I also hate the squiggles for different reasons, but that's a different thing. But my problem is that composition instructions, the grading is so much different, right? It's not, if it was just the language level, that's one thing. But the idea level, I think, is much more difficult. Unfortunately, for us, having to spend hours grading papers, right? It just takes that time. It takes innate amounts of time to really help students get where they need to go. I've taught, we have a course teaching our graduate students, teaching how to teach freshman composition. And I told students that, what I was told when I was my first pedagogical class on this, I was told that for freshman composition papers, your goal should be to grade each paper in less than 10 minutes. That's the goal. The reality is often much worse, right? It's often closer to 20, 30 minutes at least per paper, right? But the problem is that spending that much time for paper is such a huge burden on you as an instructor, and yet I personally feel guilt if I'm not giving each student the proper shrift they need to help them, because we're trying to do so much. And yet, to go back to this kind of commodification or expediency issue, right? I've got 40 of these papers together, right? And they need to have them back next week. That's a tough kind of tough thing there. So it'd be interesting to see if ChatGPT could, identify patterns, but in the end, the advice and evaluation of each student and their overall progress in the class, that's, I think, a much more difficult concept.
I wonder if, because David, you brought up the idea that our students like to use these science fiction type tools because it's something easy. If you guys find in the classroom, when you use science fiction literature, when you use text analysis using novels of science fiction, when you use Star Trek, if interest is the counteract to ease, where if we pique the students' interest with things they find interesting, do they then look beyond the easiest route to accomplish the goal and look for that step? And does science fiction and stuff that we're talking about here, Jack Williamson, is that the avenue that we should consider as talking about science fiction and teaching?
Sorry.
No, please go.
Oh, I just wouldn't even, I was actually talking with Ben yesterday about how sometimes it's not the easiest. They're not really used to reading anything that's long form. And so sometimes they're just like, what is this? And just bear with me. Get into it a little bit. And then it's sometimes a new experience to actually read novels and think imaginatively. So I agree with what you're saying in terms of it's not necessarily about being easier. It's about cultivating a new thought exercise and way of engaging them and getting them interested and getting them to kind of think outside their comfort zone and usual envelope of what's actually in front of them. Because it can be hard to imagine outside of what you see.
Well, maybe circle back to the stories that I mentioned in the beginning of the class, the writing class that I'm going to be teaching later today. This is
is only anecdotal based on past times that I've taught these two texts together. You know, the ones who walk away from Windows and the ones who stay and fight are stories that tend to be students' and they get into the discussion of it. And they start, one of the things we do is kind of imagining what our own alternative society would look like, right? And how it would or would not mirror aspects that Johnson and William are talking about. And, you know, you find students really getting into that. But then, and this was sort of prompting, like, I think about the classroom as a science fictional space. I always feel like we have to kind of claw it back to get them to write the essay or make sure that we're meeting the, you know, student learning objectives that are there. I recognize the utility and the importance of them, and we want to ensure a quality education. There's also a kind of conformity that imposes sort of limits the ways in which the classroom works.
Yeah, it's something I often see in the classroom as students, especially composition, then they don't turn to papers, right? It's like, oh man, you're almost there.
So during this discussion about student interest and like the utility of different forms of student production, because speaking in class and having a discussion is one form of student production, like writing is another one. ChatGPT is amazingly good at writing 5-paragraph essays like every student who's taught in high school, and that is part of the problem. Because what that tells me, as thinking about this from a sort of narratology, how do we frame narrative in society perspective, what that tells me is that what we are teaching as what writing is at the secondary school level is incredibly formulaic and lacks the connection between I want to talk about this because I have something I want to say and a production task. The production task, and I remember this from being a high school student, is useless to the student. The student will happily replace that with an algorithm because then you don't have to do something that means nothing to you. College writing is very different. Most students, when I taught university, had not had any experience with writing that wasn't 5 paragraphs, or possibly occasionally like the newspaper article. That was a little easier to fix. I taught history, so the newspaper article, you can get to the history essay from there. But what it makes me wonder is there a way to decouple writing from the formulaic student achievement points? Because that also turns something like ChatGPT into a tool rather than a cheat. Because that's really what, and I say this as someone who would have done it on subjects or in classes I didn't care very much about. I absolutely would have done it as a university student. So it comes from a place of not being interested in producing that thing. So what is the thing that a student is interested in producing? Is there a way of getting there that it still allows a student to learn how to write persuasively and communicate?
Yeah, I think it's tough. And some, I think, especially in composition scholars I've been working on for a while, I had, instructional classes I took in graduate school where one guy would say, I always thought it was strange, his goal was to abolish the academic paper forever, right? And he was like, instead, I'll teach my students how to use Movie Maker to make a movie, or I'll teach them how to use something else. And I was a little perplexed in the composition course. But I think he was a little facetious and a little attempted to get shocked here, because what he was doing is he's having to recreate the endeavors, but then he had to write an analytical piece of that, right? So he was still writing the matters, And I think that's something we're always, we're trying to do. I think you made a really good point about the formulaic nature of the academic, especially the 5-paragraph essay, which has become that way in part because it's like they're teaching because it's standardized testing, right? Because they are so rushed to grade all those papers, so they have to follow the model. If you do not follow that model, you will not pass the standardized exam. And it's so hard to get students to break this habit. Like, for example, even when the rhetorically ineffective students are convinced the thesis statement must be a list of their major points in their essay. It must be the first sentence of their paper, which is the worst place for it. But that's where they insist it's gotta be. And it's just so hard to get them to break these things. And yet, in a sense, it's because they've done a disservice to the larger kind of focus on standardized testing.
And I think I've kind of almost come around back the other way and focused on structure, but not just the one structure, but all the different structures, because I kind of ran into this when I started as an academic. I'm going to be creative and submit this thing to a journal that doesn't necessarily fit their format or their structure, and it's rejected. Or I create this audio tour, but it's 25 minutes long per track. It's not going to work on like the tour level. So thinking about structure, but also I think the kind of difference between anthropology and maybe creative writing is that it serves as a vehicle for your data. Like we're kind of in that mixture between the humanities and the sciences. So while there are like ethnographies that come off as literature or written as literature, right? The data is still important. And that's not something that, because of the long-term kind of habitual nature of our data gathering set, it's not something that can be replaced until ChatGPT can go live in another place for another year or two.
Well, David, I want to make sure we have enough time to get to the next event. What time should we wrap up? 9:30. We have time for another question?
Yeah.
Okay, great. I think you have a question.
Yeah, so you guys are talking about how, especially like students in high school and stuff are very used to just following like a B, C, D, this is my essay, like whatever, I don't really care about it. And it made me think of, I went to Portales High School here, and we had to do a Martin Luther King Jr. essay every single year that I was in high school, like every single year. And so finally it just kind of got to the point where all of us were like, we're just gonna keep turning the same essay, like, like it wasn't fun anymore. It didn't have any new ideas or any new prompts that we really wanted to write about. But then my senior year, I had an English teacher who kind of switched it up a little bit and was more of like, find a piece of music that was from like the civil rights era and compare it to kind of what Martin Luther King was talking about. And I had so much fun writing that like essay. It was just switching the perspective a little bit, even just to make it a little bit newer, to make it a little bit more, I don't know, just different than what I had been doing the past 3 years. That made me genuinely want to write it. And that was the first time I had felt that since I was in high school. Yeah.
Who was your teacher?
What was her name? Miss Amberlyn Malden, I think.
Oh,
Miss
yeah.
Malden. Yeah. It was great, and I loved it.
I think that's great. And to be clear, when I said earlier about standardized testing, I'm by no measure placing that blame on the backs of teachers.
Right, exactly.
Who we've been told continuously, like, the way to engage with local high schools, offer to do a free class on your subject and things. They don't have the time.
Mm-hmm.
Their time is so structured, they can't spare a class session for us to come and talk about something really new, interesting the students might like.
Right.
And it's a real kind of challenge for them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think the failures of the teacher alone, honestly. I think it's an institutional system.
Absolutely.
David, have you used YouTube video essays with your students at all?
Yeah, I tried mixing it up. I've done YouTube video essays. What I did for placement, it's not my favorite teaching methodology, but when I do online classes, one thing I started doing was incorporating Flipgrid. I think it's reasons. Anyway, but it's like instead of doing discussion boards, because students don't like discussion boards, they don't want to do discussion boards. Get them to make any kind of functional conversation, they're not going to do it. But I found that Flipgrid, what they're doing is they record short videos, like minute, 2-minute videos. And they were doing that, and they were responding to each other and engaging. And so it was nice to kind of change the format and discover. So I'm always playing with different things. I encourage students to use things they're interested in. I always have my classes do a meme forum, right? So that they can toss in memes. And that's usually a lot of fun, and students can really do that. So yeah, changing up the format is often, a good thing to try. Yeah.
All right, well, please join with me in thanking all of our panelists this morning. For showing up bright and early on the Friday morning.
I will say we have events all throughout the day here for the lectureship. In fact, if you're interested in, we can turn into a lot of AI conversation. We have a panel on artificial intelligence at 4:10 in July 111. So please come join us there. For now, right at 10 o'clock, we have our guest of honor reading with our team over in summer board. So please join us for that if you can. See y'all then.
They're messaging us on Facebook saying they can't hear anything. Can you put a microphone on the table? Just saying that the sound is really bad. And I know some of the people are speaking really softly.